I want to tell you about the invisible hand that's holding you right now. Not metaphorically, literally. Right this moment, as you're listening to my voice, there's a force pressing against every single atom in your body, pulling you down with patient, relentless gentleness. You can't see it. You can't taste it. You can't turn it off. And yet, without it, you wouldn't exist. Nothing would. No stars, no planets, no oceans, no you. This invisible hand is called gravity, and tonight I'm going to tell you its complete story, from the very beginning to the edge of what we still don't understand. And here's what makes this so beautiful. Gravity is the universe's way of saying that nothing exists alone. Everything is reaching for everything else, constantly, eternally, including you. You know what's strange? You've been experiencing gravity every single second of your entire life. And yet most of us have never really stopped to think about what it actually is. We just accept it. The apple falls. The rain comes down. We stay on the ground. Of course it does. Of course we do. But when you actually pause and ask the question, when you really look at gravity, not as background noise but as the extraordinary thing it truly is, everything changes. Because gravity isn't just a force. It's not just physics. It's the reason time exists the way it does. It's why you age. It's why your heart has to pump the way it does. It's the sculptor of galaxies and the architect of your bones. Tonight, I want to share with you everything I've learned about this invisible hand. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you're going to see the world completely differently. This is a story about falling, but it's also a story about connection, about how the universe holds itself together, about why anything exists at all instead of just floating away into nothing. And I'm going to tell it to you slowly, carefully, the way it deserves to be told, because the truth is, understanding gravity means understanding your place in the cosmos. It means seeing that you're not separate from the stars, you're made of them, and you're held by the same force that holds them. So get comfortable. Let your mind settle. We're going on a journey together, and I'm going to be with you every step of the way. Let's begin at the very beginning, before humans, before Earth, before even the concept of down existed. Imagine, if you can, the universe 13.8 billion years ago. There's no up, there's no down. In the void of space, these words are meaningless. An astronaut floating in the depths of the cosmos doesn't fall. They simply exist, drifting in whatever direction momentum carries them. But here's where it gets fascinating. In this endless darkness, something was happening. Gravity, that invisible sculptor, was already at work. You see, after the Big Bang, matter wasn't distributed perfectly evenly. There were tiny, almost imperceptible clumps, regions where just slightly more hydrogen atoms clustered together than in the space around them, and gravity, patient and relentless, began to pull. These clumps attracted more matter, slowly at first, then faster. The denser they became, the stronger their pull. Over millions of years, these clouds of hydrogen grew massive, collapsing inward under their own weight, heating up, compressing, until something miraculous happened. They ignited. The first stars were born. Now, here's what I need you to understand. These stars didn't just light up the darkness. They created down. Around each massive stellar body, space itself began to bend. Einstein showed us this. Mass curves space-time like a bowling ball on a trampoline, and in that curvature, down was born. Down became the direction toward mass. Down became the direction toward the star. But stars don't live forever. The massive ones, the giants, they burn bright and die young. And when they die spectacularly. Supernovas. Explosions so powerful they forge new elements in their final moments. Carbon, oxygen, silicon, iron, all the heavy elements that make up everything you've ever touched. They were created in the death throes of ancient stars. These elements scattered across space, mixing with hydrogen clouds, and the cycle began again. New stars formed, but this time they weren't alone. The debris swirling around them began to clump together. Pebbles became rocks, rocks became boulders, boulders became planetesimals, and eventually planets formed. Worlds with their own gravitational pull, their own definition of down. Our planet formed about 4.5 billion years ago from a spinning disk of dust and debris. At first, it was a molten hellscape. No oceans, no atmosphere worth mentioning, just a ball of liquid rock cooling in the void. But something remarkable happened. The Earth had just the right mass, just the right distance from the Sunday, and over millions of years, it cooled enough for water vapor to condense. Rain fell on those hot rocks for the first time. Oceans formed. And here's where it gets interesting. Because now we had gravity strong enough to hold onto an atmosphere, but not so strong that it crushed everything into oblivion. We had a magnetic field protecting us from solar radiation. We had liquid water. We had chemistry happening at a scale the universe had never seen before. In those early oceans, molecules were colliding, combining, breaking apart, combining again. Billions upon billions of random experiments happening every second in every drop of water across an entire planet. And eventually, impossibly, one of those combinations did something different. It copied itself. Think about that. A molecule that could make more of itself. It wasn't alive. Not really. Not yet. But it was the first step. Because once you have something that can replicate, you have something that can change. You have variation. You have selection. You have evolution. Those first self-replicating molecules were fragile. Most fell apart almost immediately, but some lasted longer than others. Some were better at grabbing resources, better at making copies, and those were the ones that persisted. That spread, that changed. Over millions of years, these molecules became more complex. They built protective shells around themselves. They learned to work together. Single cells became colonies. Colonies became organisms. And slowly, impossibly slowly, life became more than just chemistry. It became biology. For billions of years, life was simple. Single-celled organisms floating in the ocean. But they were learning. They were evolving. They figured out how to harvest energy from sunlight. They figured out how to breathe oxygen. They figured out how to move. And then, about 540 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. Life exploded. The Cambrian explosion. In a geological blink of an eye, the ocean became a carnival of strange and wonderful forms. Creatures with eyes, creatures with shells, predators and prey locked in an evolutionary arms race that accelerated innovation at a pace the planet had never seen. Think about what vision meant. For 3 billion years, life was essentially blind, bumping around in the dark, following chemical trails. Then suddenly, eyes. The ability to see light, to detect movement, to hunt from a distance. It changed everything. If you can see your prey, you need to be faster. If you can be seen, you need armor, or camouflage, or weapons of your own. The oceans filled with trilobites, those armored arthropods that dominated the seafloor for 270 million years. Anomalocaris, a shrimp-like predator, nearly a meter long with compound eyes and grasping appendages. Hallucigenia, which looked like a fever dream, with spines and tentacles in configurations so bizarre that scientists initially reconstructed it upside down. And here's what gets me. Every major body plan we see today, every fundamental way of building an animal, appeared during this period. Arthropods, mollusks, chordates, the group that would eventually include us. The basic toolkit of animal architecture was assembled in roughly 25 million years. But the ocean was just the beginning. The real frontier was still waiting, harsh and empty and flooded with ultraviolet radiation. The land, nothing lived there yet. The continents were barren rock and sand, baked under a sun that would kill anything that dared crawl out of the water. But life had already been quietly working on the solution. Photosynthetic organisms had been pumping oxygen into the atmosphere for over 1 billion years. And slowly, molecule by molecule, that oxygen was forming ozone. A shield, a protective layer high in the atmosphere that filtered out the worst of the sun's radiation. And as that shield thickened, the land became possible. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because once life made it to land, it didn't just survive, it exploded. Think about what the land offered that the ocean never could. Space. Unlimited space. In the ocean, you're fighting for every cubic meter of water. You're competing with millions of other organisms for nutrients, for light, for room to exist. But the land was empty. Virgin territory stretching as far as the eye could see. No competition, no predators, just opportunity and sunlight. Direct, unfiltered sunlight. In the ocean, light penetrates maybe 100 meters on a good day. Below that, it's twilight. Below 200 meters, it's eternal darkness. But on land, every plant gets a front row seat to the sun. No need to fight your way to the surface. No need to outcompete your neighbors for that precious light. Just spread your leaves and drink it in. The first forests appeared about 385 million years ago, and I want you to picture what that must have looked like, because these weren't the forests we know today. These were alien landscapes, forests of giant ferns and club mosses, some reaching heights of 30 meters or more, trees that reproduced with spores, not seeds. A world of green stretching to the horizon, but silent. No birds, no insects buzzing, no mammals rustling through the undergrowth. Just plants and arthropods, giant millipedes the size of cars crawling through the leaf litter, dragonflies with wingspans of over 2 feet. This was the Carboniferous period, and it was weird, beautiful, but weird. And here's the thing that blows my mind. Those forests, they're the reason you can drive a car today. They're the reason we have coal. Because trees had just invented lignin, this tough, woody substance that makes trees strong. But nothing had evolved to break it down yet. So when those trees died, they just stayed there. Piled up, layer upon layer of dead plant material that couldn't decompose, buried under sediment, compressed over millions of years. That's coal, ancient sunlight, locked away in rock. The Carboniferous forests were so productive, so abundant, that they literally changed the planet's carbon cycle. But here's where it gets truly wild. Those forests, those towering, alien landscapes, existed because of a loophole in evolution, a temporary gap in nature's system. You see, lignin is tough stuff. It's what makes wood times woody asterisk. It's a complex polymer, difficult to break down, and when it first appeared in plants, nothing on Earth could digest it. No bacteria, no fungi, nothing. So when those massive trees fell, they just stayed there. For millions of years, dead trees piled up because evolution hadn't caught up yet. Nature hadn't figured out the decomposition code. Think about that. We're burning forests that accumulated because decay didn't exist the way it does today. Eventually, fungi evolved the enzymes to break down lignin, white rot fungi, brown rot fungi, the unsung heroes of the carbon cycle. But by then, the damage was done, or the gift was given, depending on how you look at it. Those accumulated forests became coal, and coal became the engine of the Industrial Revolution, which means human civilization as we know it, factories, railways, cities, electricity was built on an evolutionary accident, a brief window when trees could form faster than they could rot. That thought keeps me up at night. Our entire modern world, powered by a glitch in the matrix, a moment when nature's recycling system was offline. And we found it, dug it up, set it on fire, released millions of years of captured sunlight back into the atmosphere in just 2 centuries. We're running the tape in reverse at 10,000 times the speed. Here's another piece of the puzzle that blows my mind. Oxygen. We talk about climate change, about carbon dioxide, but we rarely talk about the other side of the equation. During the Carboniferous, oxygen levels were insane. Estimates put atmospheric oxygen at around 35%. Today it's 21%. That extra oxygen had consequences, huge consequences. Remember those giant dragonflies I mentioned? They weren't just big for fun. Insects don't have lungs. They breathe through tubes called spiracles, passive diffusion. More oxygen means those tubes work better, which means insects can grow larger, much larger. We're talking dragonflies with 70-centimeter wingspans, millipedes the size of alligators, scorpions as long as your arm. The Carboniferous was the age of arthropod giants, and it was oxygen that made it possible. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because oxygen, for all its life-giving properties, is also a destroyer. Think about what happens when you leave a sliced apple on the counter. It browns. That's oxidation. The same process that rusts iron, that ages our cells, that slowly breaks down everything it touches. Oxygen is both creator and cremator, and nowhere is this dual nature more evident than in what it did to our planet's climate. During the Carboniferous, all those massive forests were pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. Trees were growing faster than anything could decompose them. Remember, fungi hadn't figured out how to break down lignin yet, so when these giants fell, they just stayed there, layer upon layer of dead wood, compressing over millions of years into something we know very well today: coal. Every coal seam you've ever seen, every chunk of anthracite, every bit of lignite, it's all compressed Carboniferous forest. The Earth's carbon, locked away underground for 300 million years. And as that carbon disappeared from the atmosphere, temperatures began to plummet. The oxygen levels that had enabled giants now became their curse. As CO2 levels dropped and oxygen soared to nearly 35%, the climate destabilized. Ice caps formed at the poles, glaciers advanced. The warm, humid paradise that had spawned dragonflies the size of hawks began to freeze, and then came the fires. With oxygen levels that high, the entire planet became a tinderbox. Lightning strikes that might have caused small, localized burns instead triggered infernos that consumed thousands of square miles. Forests that had taken centuries to grow burned in days. The charcoal layers we find in Carboniferous rock tell the story of a world repeatedly engulfed in flames. These fires weren't just destructive, they fundamentally reshaped the evolution of life itself. Plants that survived developed thick bark, fire-resistant seeds, and the ability to resprout from roots after flames had swept through. We can see this evolutionary arms race preserved in the fossil record. Early Carboniferous plants with thin, vulnerable tissues giving way to later species with increasingly sophisticated fire defense mechanisms. And the animals? They faced an impossible choice: stay in the forests and risk incineration, or venture into open ground where new predators waited. The fossil evidence shows us that many species chose the latter, leading to an explosive diversification of life in floodplains and early wetland environments. Creatures that had never left the forest canopy were suddenly forced to adapt to life on the ground. It's a pattern we see repeated throughout history: catastrophe forcing innovation, destruction creating opportunity. But here's what really keeps me up at night. Those fires released unimaginable amounts of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. All that carbon that had been locked away in plant matter, millions of years of careful sequestration, went up in smoke in geological instants. We're talking about a feedback loop that makes modern climate concerns look tame by comparison. More oxygen meant bigger fires. Bigger fires meant more CO2. More CO2 meant climate chaos that rippled across the entire planet. The temperature swings during the late Carboniferous were extreme. We find tropical plant fossils right next to glacial deposits, evidence of a climate system lurching between extremes like a drunk driver swerving across lanes. Species that had thrived for millions of years suddenly found their environments transformed beyond recognition. The coal swamps that defined the period began to retreat. Sea levels fluctuated wildly, and through it all, the fires kept burning. The Permian began with a world still recognizable from the Carboniferous, but it would end in a way that defies comprehension. The supercontinent of Pangaea was now fully assembled, one massive landmass stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a single enormous ocean. Imagine every piece of dry land you know compressed into one colossal fortress of rock and sand. And here's where things get strange. With so much land locked together, the interior of Pangaea became a wasteland. No ocean breezes reached the heart of the continent. No moisture penetrated thousands of miles inland. What you got instead were deserts that would make the Sahara look like a pleasant beach vacation. Temperature swings so extreme that rocks cracked from the thermal stress. Dust storms that could bury entire ecosystems. But life, stubborn as always, adapted. The synapsids, our distant ancestors, thrived in this harsh world. These weren't dinosaurs. They came before. Some looked like bizarre crosses between reptiles and mammals, with sprawling limbs and thick, leathery skin. Others developed specialized features we'd recognize today. Differentiated teeth, more efficient breathing, possibly even the beginnings of warm-bloodedness. The Dimetrodon, with its dramatic sail-like back, wasn't just showing off. That sail was a solar panel and a radiator combined, helping it heat up quickly in the morning and cool down when the desert sun became unbearable. Evolutionary engineering at its finest. Meanwhile, reptiles were experimenting with their own designs. Some took to the water, others learned to burrow deep underground, escaping the surface hellscape entirely. A few even glided between the scattered trees, early prototypes of flight. For millions of years, this system worked. The world was harsh but stable, predictably unpredictable, if that makes sense. Species came and went, ecosystems shifted, but life continued its relentless march forward. Then, around 252 million years ago, something happened that makes every other catastrophe we've discussed look like a minor inconvenience. The Permian-Triassic extinction event. Scientists call it the Great Dying. And trust me, that name doesn't even come close to capturing the horror. Imagine waking up one morning to find that 9 out of every 10 species on Earth had vanished. Not over centuries, not over millennia, over a geological eye blink. That's what the Great Dying was. Roughly 96% of all marine species gone. 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species erased. Insects, which had survived everything evolution threw at them, experienced their only known mass extinction. This wasn't just a reset button. This was nearly the end of the story entirely. And here's where it gets personal for us. This extinction was likely caused by massive volcanic eruptions in what's now Siberia. These weren't your garden variety volcanoes. The Siberian traps erupted for millions of years, pumping unfathomable amounts of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Sound familiar? The planet heated up rapidly. Ocean chemistry changed. Oxygen levels plummeted. It was a cascade of catastrophe, each problem feeding into the next, until the Earth became nearly uninhabitable. The oceans turned acidic and oxygen depleted. The land became a scorched wasteland. Temperatures soared by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. For complex life that had spent hundreds of millions of years adapting to stable conditions, this was apocalyptic. The fossil record from this period is haunting. Layers upon layers of rock with almost nothing in them, just silence in stone. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Life almost didn't recover. For millions of years after the Great Dying, the Earth remained a hostile, barren place. Ecosystems were so devastated that it took roughly 10 million years for biodiversity to bounce back. That's longer than the entire existence of our genus Homo. We're talking about a planetary wound so deep that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of evolution forever. The survivors, they were the lucky ones, the resilient ones, the ones that happened to have the right traits at the right time. Small, adaptable creatures that could survive on scraps. And from those survivors, eventually, the dinosaurs would rise. But here's where it gets wild. The dinosaurs didn't just show up overnight. No, it took millions of years of trial and error, of evolution sculpting and refining. The first dinosaurs weren't the towering giants we picture in our minds. They were small, bipedal, no bigger than a dog. They scurried through forests that still bore the scars of the Permian extinction, competing with other reptiles for dominance. And then something happened. Something clicked. The dinosaurs found their edge. Maybe it was their upright posture, allowing them to move faster and more efficiently. Maybe it was their respiratory system, more advanced than anything before it, letting them sustain activity in ways their competitors couldn't. Or maybe, just maybe, it was timing. They survived when others didn't, and suddenly the playing field was theirs. Over the next 100 million years, they diversified into every ecological niche you can imagine. Predators with teeth like knives, herbivores with armor plating that could shrug off attacks, creatures so massive they made the earth tremble with every step. The dinosaurs became the undisputed rulers of the planet, so successful, so dominant, that it seemed nothing could ever topple them. But here's the thing about dominance. It's never permanent. Ever. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how perfectly adapted, the universe doesn't care. It'll throw a curveball when you least expect it. And that curveball came 66 million years ago, in the form of a rock from space. An asteroid, 6 miles wide, traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour. It slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, with a force so immense it makes every nuclear weapon ever built look like a firecracker. The impact released more energy than 1 billion atomic bombs. The explosion vaporized rock, sent shockwaves rippling across continents, triggered tsunamis that dwarfed mountains. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what came after. Dust and debris filled the atmosphere, blocking out the sun for months, maybe years. Temperatures plummeted. Photosynthesis ground to a halt. Plants died. Then the herbivores starved. Then the carnivores that fed on them. The extinction didn't happen all at once. It cascaded, like dominoes. But each domino took thousands of years to fall, which means we barely noticed until half of them were already down. The fossil record shows us something haunting. Bones of animals that migrated hundreds of miles, trying to escape the cold, only to find more cold. Herds that moved south, then further south, until there was nowhere left to go. You can see it in the sediment layers, populations contracting, compressing, desperately clinging to smaller and smaller habitable zones. And here's what really gets me. Many of these species had survived for millions of years. They'd weathered previous ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts. They were tested, proven, resilient. But this event was different. This cold lasted so long that adaptation couldn't keep pace. Evolution needs time, but it also needs a stable enough environment for beneficial mutations to take hold. When the entire planet becomes hostile for tens of thousands of years, there's nowhere to adapt to. There's just survival or extinction. The oceans tell an even darker story. Marine life, which should have been somewhat buffered from atmospheric changes, suffered catastrophically. Why? Because cold water holds more oxygen. Yes, but it also disrupts ocean currents. The great conveyor belts that circulate nutrients, that regulate temperature, that connect ecosystems across thousands of miles, they weakened or stopped entirely. Coral reefs collapsed. Not the individual corals, but entire reef systems that had existed for epochs. When they died, so did the countless species that depended on them. It's like burning down an apartment building that housed 10,000 families. The structure is gone, but so is an entire community. an entire interconnected web of relationships that can't be rebuilt overnight. In fact, some of those reef ecosystems never fully recovered. The world moved on, but it moved on without them. That's what we're risking with our economic ecosystems. When we lose a small business, we're not just losing a transaction point, we're losing the relationships it fostered, the informal networks it supported, the community trust it built over decades. I'll give you a concrete example. There's a hardware store in Vermont that closed in 2019 after 87 years in business. Big box stores had finally worn it down. Now, on paper, this shouldn't matter, right? You can still buy hammers and nails. The products didn't disappear. But here's what else closed with that store. The elderly owner who knew every contractor in 3 counties and would informally apprentice young people, teaching them about materials and craftsmanship. The bulletin board where locals posted jobs and services. The counter where farmers would gather on slow Tuesday afternoons and share information about weather patterns, crop prices, and land management. The informal lending system, where regular customers could take supplies on credit during tough months and pay when they could. That hardware store wasn't just selling products. It was a knowledge hub, a community centre, an informal credit union, and a training ground, all rolled into one. When it closed, that entire ecosystem collapsed. And unlike a coral reef, where you might reintroduce species and hope for regeneration, these social and economic ecosystems are even harder to restore. Because trust takes time, networks take time, shared knowledge and informal systems take time. You can't just open a new business and expect all of that to instantly reappear. The institutional memory is gone. The relationships are severed. The younger generation that would have learned at that counter, that would have been mentored by that owner, they're somewhere else now, learning different things, or maybe not learning at all. This is the hidden cost of monopolization that never shows up in quarterly earnings reports or stock prices. We're hemorrhaging social capital, and most people don't even realize it's happening until it's already gone. And here's what makes it even more insidious. We've convinced ourselves that this is actually progress. We've been sold this narrative that efficiency equals advancement, that consolidation is inevitable, that this is just how modern economies work. We've accepted the elimination of human connection as the price of convenience, and we've been taught to celebrate it. Think about how we talk about these changes. We don't say, another community gathering place closed. We say, the market disrupted inefficient retail. We don't acknowledge thousands of mentorship relationships severed. We frame it as legacy business models failing to adapt. The language itself has been weaponized to make us complicit in our own social impoverishment. I remember talking to an economist at a conference who genuinely could not understand my concern. He kept pointing to charts showing lower consumer prices, increased selection, improved logistics. And he wasn't wrong about those metrics. They were all technically accurate. But when I asked him about the social infrastructure being dismantled, he looked at me like I was speaking a different language. That's not economics, he said. That's sociology. And that, right there, is the problem. We've compartmentalized human existence into these neat academic categories, as if the way we organize our economy has nothing to do with the fabric of our society. As if you can optimize for pure economic efficiency without consequence to everything else. It's like a doctor who only treats symptoms in isolation, never considering that the human body is an interconnected system. The tech platforms understood this better than anyone, which is why they deliberately used social connection as their Trojan horse. They didn't sell us productivity tools. They sold us connection. Facebook didn't say, come manage your data on our servers. They said, connect with friends and family. Amazon didn't pitch centralized retail monopoly. They promised convenience and community through reviews and recommendations. They knew that humans crave connection, so they offered a digital facsimile of it, then slowly replaced the real thing. And here's the truly insidious part. They made us thank them for it. Every notification, every like, every comment became a little hit of validation. We weren't just using these platforms. We were feeding them our emotional needs our psychological vulnerabilities, our deepest human desires for recognition and belonging, and they engineered the experience to make sure we kept coming back. Sean Parker, Facebook's first president, admitted it openly years later. He said they knew exactly what they were doing when they designed the like button and notification systems. They were exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology, creating a social validation feedback loop that would keep you scrolling, keep you checking, keep you coming back for just one more hit of that digital dopamine. This wasn't accidental. This was behavioral engineering at scale. Think about how Instagram evolved. It started as a simple photo sharing app, creative, personal. Then Facebook bought it. Within a few years, it became an algorithmic feed designed to maximize engagement, which really means maximize anxiety. They introduced the hiding of likes in some regions, not to protect mental health, but to test whether removing visible metrics would change user behavior. Every feature, every tweak, every A/B test was about finding the precise psychological buttons to push to keep you hooked. YouTube did the same thing. The autoplay feature wasn't designed to help you find content you'd love. It was designed to keep you watching indefinitely. The algorithm doesn't recommend what's best for you. It recommends what keeps you on the platform longest. That's why conspiracy theories and outrage content spread so effectively. Not because they're true or valuable, but because they trigger engagement patterns that the algorithm rewards. And here's what makes it even more insidious. We've started to internalize the algorithm's preferences as our own. We think we're choosing what to watch, what to read, what to believe, but our choices have been pre-processed, filtered through a system designed to maximize a metric we never agreed to optimize for. I remember having a conversation with a friend who'd fallen deep into a particular ideological rabbit hole. Every video he showed me, every article, every expert he cited, they all came from his YouTube recommendations or his social media feed. When I asked him how he found these sources, he said, "I just follow where the information leads me." But he wasn't following information. He was following an algorithmic pathway designed to keep him clicking. The algorithm had learned his engagement patterns, identified what kept him watching longest, and served him an increasingly concentrated diet of content that confirmed and amplified his existing views. This is what I call algorithmic radicalization, and it's not limited to political extremism. It happens with health misinformation, with financial schemes, with relationship advice that destroys relationships. The algorithm doesn't care about the real-world consequences of the beliefs it cultivates. It only cares that you keep watching. We see this playing out at scale in recommendation engines everywhere. Someone watches one video about a particular topic, and suddenly their entire feed becomes dominated by increasingly extreme versions of that content. The algorithm has learned that novelty and intensity drive engagement, so it constantly escalates, always pushing toward more dramatic, more emotional, more attention-grabbing material. And because the algorithm operates on the level of pure pattern recognition without semantic understanding, it can't distinguish between educational escalation and harmful escalation. It can't tell the difference between deepening genuine expertise and descending into conspiracy thinking. It only knows what keeps people watching. This creates information bubbles that are far more sophisticated and dangerous than the old filter bubble we used to worry about. These aren't just bubbles that show you more of what you already believe. These are dynamic systems that actively shape what you come to believe, that guide your attention along pathways optimized for engagement rather than truth. And we're barely beginning to reckon with what this means. The scariest part? These systems have gotten so sophisticated that they don't just respond to what you want, they shape what you want. They create desire where none existed before. Let me give you a concrete example. A few years ago, researchers at Facebook, before it became Meta, ran an experiment. They manipulated the emotional content of news feeds for nearly 700,000 users without their knowledge or consent. They showed some people more positive posts, others more negative posts. And here's what they found. The emotional content people saw directly influenced the emotional content they themselves posted. See sadness, post sadness. See joy, post joy. When this became public, there was outrage, and rightly so. But here's what most people missed in the controversy. This wasn't some rogue experiment by mad scientists. This was just making visible what these platforms do every single day. Every time the algorithm decides what to show you, it's running this exact same experiment. It's testing what emotional buttons to push to keep you scrolling. The only difference was that this time, they admitted it. And the effects run deeper than just your mood. These systems are literally changing how you think. There's fascinating research now showing that people who get their news primarily from algorithmic feeds develop different cognitive patterns than people who seek out information directly. They become better at rapid pattern recognition across disconnected pieces of information, but they become worse at deep, linear thinking, at following extended arguments, at holding complex, contradictory ideas in mind simultaneously. In other words, we're being optimized. Our brains are being shaped to fit the medium, and the medium is designed for one thing, keeping you engaged long enough to see the next ad. You know what really keeps me up at night? It's not that these companies are evil. Most of the people working there are genuinely brilliant, well-intentioned individuals who want to make the world better. The problem is structural. The problem is that the business model advertising creates an inherent conflict between what's good for you and what's good for the bottom line. And that conflict plays out in 1,000 subtle ways every single day. It shapes the features they build, the content they promote, the boundaries they set or don't set. Think about autoplay, for instance. That feature where the next video starts automatically before you've even decided if you want to watch it. There's no technical reason that needs to exist. It's not solving a problem you had. You weren't sitting there thinking, man, I wish videos would just keep playing without my consent. But from a business perspective, it's genius. It keeps you in the app. It removes the natural pause where you might think, okay, maybe that's enough for today. It turns your viewing session into a river with no obvious place to get out. Or consider the way they've designed notifications. They don't just tell you something happened. They're crafted to create anxiety, curiosity, urgency, the little red badge. The preview that shows just enough to make you wonder. The strategic timing based on when you're most likely to be vulnerable to interruption. These aren't accidents. These are choices made by teams of designers who understand human psychology better than most therapists. And here's what makes it so insidious. They're not doing anything illegal. They're not even doing anything that would be considered unethical by traditional business standards. They're just optimizing. They're just trying to make their product more engaging, more competitive, more successful. But optimization without values is just exploitation with better branding. The advertising model creates a fundamental misalignment. In a healthy market relationship, the business succeeds when the customer is satisfied. You buy a good chair, it supports your back, you're happy, the chair company prospers, incentives aligned. But in the attention economy, the product succeeds when you're unsatisfied enough to keep seeking, but engaged enough to keep scrolling. They don't want you content, they want you stimulated. There's a massive difference. A satisfied person closes the app. A stimulated person keeps scrolling. And once you understand that distinction, you see it everywhere. Watch a child with a tablet. They're not smiling. They're not laughing. Their face is blank, almost trance-like, but their thumb never stops moving. That's not joy. That's compulsion, wearing the mask of engagement. The platforms know this. They've known it for years. There are leaked documents from Facebook's own research showing they understood Instagram was harmful to teenage girls' mental health. They knew it was increasing anxiety, depression, body image issues, and they didn't pull back. They doubled down because the harm and the engagement were coming from the same source. You can't separate the damage from the business model. It's like asking a cigarette company to make you healthy while keeping you addicted. The request itself is contradictory. And here's where it gets darker. These platforms have created something I call weaponized envy. They've turned comparison into a competitive sport where everyone loses except the house. You're not just seeing your friends' vacation photos anymore. You're seeing a curated highlight reel designed to maximize your feeling of missing out, amplified by algorithms that know exactly which images make you feel inadequate. The girl posting the bikini photo isn't your enemy. She's another player in the same rigged game, chasing validation she'll never fully receive because the system is designed to always leave you wanting more. She gets her hits of dopamine from the likes, you get yours from the scroll, and the platform gets your attention, your data, and your mental health as collateral damage. We've normalized a form of psychological self-harm. Imagine if every day, millions of people voluntarily walked into a room where strangers criticized their appearance, success, and life choices for hours. We'd call that masochism. But put it on a phone and call it social media, and suddenly, it's just how we live. The average person checks their phone 6 times a day. Every 10 minutes of your waking life, you're reaching for that little rectangle of anxiety. That's not accidental. That's not a personal failing. That's a multi-billion-dollar engineering effort, working exactly as intended. And here's what makes it truly insidious. They've convinced us that awareness equals immunity. We think knowing about these tactics somehow protects us. Oh, I understand the algorithm. I know they're trying to manipulate me. I'm too smart to fall for it. That's like saying you understand gravity, so you won't fall if you jump off a building. The truth is, awareness is just the first step. It doesn't actually change your behavior unless you take concrete action. You can intellectually understand that processed food is engineered to be addictive, but that knowledge doesn't stop the craving when you're standing in front of the vending machine at 3 p.m. I learned this the hard way. For years, I told myself I had it under control. I understood the psychology. I was monitoring my usage. I'd even lecture my friends about the dangers of social media while simultaneously checking my phone under the table. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. It wasn't until I actually measured my usage, really measured it, with brutal honesty, that I confronted the reality. 6 hours a day. That's a part-time job. That's 42 hours a week. That's 2,184 hours a year spent scrolling through an endless feed of content. I could barely remember 5 minutes later. What could you build with 2,184 hours? You could learn a language fluently, master an instrument, write a novel, start a business, develop a genuine skill that compounds over time instead of evaporating like morning mist. But here's where it gets even more brutal. Those platforms don't just steal your time. They reshape how your brain works. They literally change the physical structure of your neural pathways. Every time you get that little dopamine hit from a notification, you're reinforcing a circuit. Every time you reach for your phone out of boredom, you're strengthening a habit. Every time you choose the immediate gratification of the scroll over the delayed satisfaction of deep work, you're training yourself to be less capable of sustained attention. You're not just wasting time. You're actively diminishing your capacity to do meaningful work. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. The apps are designed with variable reward schedules, the same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines addictive. You don't know if the next swipe will show you something boring or something that triggers a massive dopamine hit. That uncertainty keeps you locked in, always chasing that next potential reward. This isn't an accident. There are teams of engineers at these companies, many of them with PhDs in neuroscience and behavioral psychology, whose entire job is to make these apps as addictive as possible. They study how to hijack your brain's reward circuitry. They A/B test different notification timings to find the exact moment when you're most likely to open the app. They fine-tune the algorithms to show you content right before you are about to close the app, pulling you back in for just one more scroll. And we wonder why we can't focus. But let me tell you something that might actually give you hope. Your brain is plastic. Neuroplasticity means your brain can change. can rewire itself, can build new neural pathways. The damage isn't permanent. But here's the catch, it requires you to actually do something about it. You need to start treating your attention like the finite, precious resource it actually is. Because that's what it is. You have maybe 16 waking hours in a day, maybe 4 to 6 of those, if you're lucky, where you're capable of deep, focused work. That's your window. That's your opportunity to create something meaningful, to learn something valuable, to build skills that actually matter. Every minute you spend scrolling is a minute stolen from that window, and you never get it back. Never. You can earn more money. You can make new friends. You can even rebuild relationships. But you cannot get back time. Once it's gone forever. So ask yourself, what are you trading your irreplaceable hours for? What are you getting in return for your attention? Dopamine hits from watching strangers dance? A vague sense of anxiety about world events you can't control? The illusion of connection while actually becoming more isolated? That's the digital diet we're on. And just like eating junk food every day, we don't notice the damage until we're too far gone. I want you to try something with me. Think about the last time you learned something genuinely difficult. Not a fun fact, not a life hack. I'm talking about something that made your brain hurt. Something that required you to sit with confusion for days or weeks before it clicked. Can you remember? For most people, that moment exists somewhere in school. Maybe it was calculus. Maybe it was learning a second language. Maybe it was figuring out how to write a proper essay. Whatever it was, it required sustained attention, repeated failure, and the willingness to feel stupid for a while. That feeling, that uncomfortable, frustrated, I don't get it yet feeling, that's what actual learning feels like. And we've designed a world that lets us avoid it completely. We've replaced deep learning with content consumption. We've replaced skill development with tutorial watching. We've replaced the hard work of mastery with the comforting illusion that knowing about something is the same as knowing how to do it. I've watched thousands of hours of cooking videos. I could probably explain the Maillard reaction to you. I know what mise en place means, but put me in a kitchen and ask me to cook a decent meal from scratch. I'd struggle, because watching isn't doing. Consuming isn't learning. The same applies to everything. We watch fitness videos instead of exercising. We read about productivity instead of being productive. We consume content about living better, while our actual lives remain unchanged. And here's the cruel irony. All that passive consumption makes us feel like we're improving, like we're growing. We're not stagnant. We tell ourselves, look at all the information we're absorbing. But information without application is just entertainment dressed up as education. And let's be honest, most of us have become entertainment addicts, masquerading as knowledge seekers. We've confused the dopamine hit of learning something new with the hard work of actually becoming someone new. I see it in my own patterns. I'll watch a documentary about productivity and feel productive. I'll listen to a podcast about discipline while procrastinating on the very thing that requires discipline. I'll read an article about focus while my attention fractures across 12 browser tabs. The irony would be funny if it weren't so painfully common. This is what I call aspirational consumption. We consume content about the person we want to become instead of doing the work to actually become that person. We follow fitness influencers instead of going to the gym. We watch videos about successful entrepreneurs instead of building our own businesses. We read about minimalism while our homes overflow with stuff we don't need. The content makes us feel like we're moving in the right direction. It gives us a temporary sense of progress without requiring any actual progress. It's self-improvement as spectator sport. And the platforms? They love this. They're not designed to transform you, they're designed to keep you watching. The algorithm doesn't care if you're bettering yourself. It cares if you're coming back. So it feeds you more of what feels good, not what actually helps. That's why you can spend 6 months watching productivity content and still be just as unproductive. The content was never meant to solve your problem. It was meant to keep you engaged with the problem. Think about the last truly transformative thing you learned online. Not something interesting or entertaining. Something that genuinely changed how you operate in the world. Something you actually applied and integrated into your life. For most of us, that list is shockingly short compared to the thousands of hours we've spent consuming content. Because transformation doesn't come from consumption. It comes from confrontation with yourself, with your habits, with the gap between who you are and who you claim you want to be. The self-improvement industry has built a brilliant business model around keeping you in a perpetual state of preparation. They've convinced you that you're always just one more course away, one more book away, one more seminar away from being ready to actually do the thing. It's genius, really. They've turned transformation into a subscription service. But here's what nobody tells you. The feeling of being ready never arrives. It's not a destination. It's not a threshold you cross after consuming enough content. Readiness is a myth we use to justify delay. You know who feels ready? Nobody. Nobody who's ever done anything worth doing felt ready beforehand. They felt terrified, unprepared, inadequate, and they did it anyway. I watch people treat self-improvement content like a security blanket. They clutch it tight, letting it comfort them with the illusion of progress while avoiding the actual risk of change. Because as long as you're learning, you can tell yourself you're working on it. As long as you're consuming, you can maintain the identity of someone who's growing without facing the vulnerability of actually trying and potentially failing. And that's the real function of this consumption loop. It's a sophisticated avoidance mechanism. It lets you feel productive while avoiding the emotional exposure of genuine transformation. You're not procrastinating. After all, you're learning, you're preparing, you're being strategic, except you're not. You're hiding. The market has figured out exactly how to monetize your fear of inadequacy. They've turned your legitimate desire for growth into an endless scroll of content that keeps you coming back but never actually moving forward. Every video promises to be the one that changes everything, and none of them do. Because the change was never supposed to come from the video. It was supposed to come from you. Think about the last thing you learned that you actually implemented. Not the last thing you found interesting or insightful. The last thing you genuinely integrated into your life in a way that changed your behavior. For most people, that's a much shorter list than their watch history would suggest. And that's the fundamental problem with how we approach learning today. We've optimized for the wrong metric. We've built an entire ecosystem around content consumption, not transformation, views, not values, engagement, not embodiment. Think about the infrastructure we've created. Recommendation algorithms designed to keep you watching, not growing. Playlists that extend infinitely in every direction, creating the illusion of a learning journey that's really just an entertainment treadmill. We've gamified education in a way that rewards the appearance of learning without demanding the substance of it. I see this in myself constantly. I'll watch a documentary about stoicism and feel enlightened for an afternoon, then completely lose my composure the next time someone cuts me off in traffic. I'll consume a brilliant analysis of time management principles, nod along enthusiastically, and then spend the next 3 hours doing exactly what I was doing before. The content passes through me like water through a sieve. It touches everything and changes nothing. And here's what makes this pattern so insidious. The temporary high of feeling informed actually becomes a substitute for the harder work of becoming transformed. You get just enough dopamine from the learning experience itself that you never feel the urgency to apply it. It's like going to the gym, taking a photo of the equipment, and expecting muscle growth. The documentation of proximity to knowledge isn't the same as the acquisition of knowledge. We've become what I call informed bystanders. We can speak intelligently about 1,000 topics we've never actually practiced. We're fluent in theories we've never tested. We can quote frameworks we've never implemented. And because we can participate in conversations about these things, because we can nod along when others mention them, we genuinely believe we know them. But knowledge without application isn't knowledge at all. It's trivia. It's decoration for your personality. Real learning is uncomfortable because it demands change. And change means admitting that the way you were doing things before was suboptimal. And here's what nobody tells you about that discomfort. It's supposed to be there. It's not a bug in the system. It's the system. When you feel that resistance, that friction, that voice in your head saying, "This is hard," or "I don't get this," or "Maybe I'm just not smart enough for this," that's not a sign you're failing. That's the sign you're actually learning. But we've been conditioned to avoid that feeling at all costs. We live in a world of instant gratification, where if something doesn't click immediately, we can just swipe to the next thing. Can't solve that problem? Watch another video? Book too challenging? Find the summary. Concept too abstract? Look for the simplified version. And I get it. I really do. Nobody wants to feel stupid. Nobody wants to sit with confusion. But here's the brutal truth. If you're always comfortable, you're not growing. You're just maintaining. You're treading water in the shallow end while convincing yourself you're swimming. Real learning, the kind that actually transforms you, requires you to sit in that discomfort long enough for something to shift. It requires you to wrestle with ideas that don't make sense yet, to read paragraphs 3, 4, 5 times until the meaning finally clicks, to solve problems incorrectly a dozen times before you find the right path. This is why the smartest people I know aren't the ones who understand everything quickly. They're the ones who are willing to not understand for longer. They have a higher tolerance for ambiguity, for confusion, for that awful feeling of being lost in the material. They don't need every concept gift-wrapped and simplified. They're willing to do the uncomfortable work of building understanding from the ground up, brick by brick, even when the foundation is shaky and nothing makes sense yet, because they know something that most people never figure out. Clarity is earned, not given. Understanding is built, not downloaded. You don't get to skip the confusion phase. You have to go through it. That's why when you see someone who's brilliant at something, you're not seeing the result of their intelligence. You're seeing the result of their confusion tolerance. You're seeing someone who sat with the discomfort longer than most people would, who kept poking at the thing that didn't make sense until it finally clicked. Mozart wasn't born understanding music theory. He was born into a house where his father drilled him relentlessly from age 3. The genius wasn't innate. It was built through thousands of hours of structured confusion, guided failure, deliberate practice. We remember the music. We forget the 10-year-old crying at the keyboard. Einstein didn't have some magic brain chemistry. He had an obsessive tolerance for sitting with paradoxes that made other physicists uncomfortable. While everyone else moved on to more tractable problems, he stayed with the weird stuff, the stuff that didn't fit, the equations that broke. That's not genius. That's stubbornness meeting curiosity. And here's what nobody tells you about this process. The confusion never fully goes away. Even experts are confused. They're just confused about more sophisticated things. A beginner guitarist is confused about where to put their fingers. A master is confused about how to make a phrase breathe properly, how to make silence say as much as sound. Understanding isn't a destination where confusion ends. It's a ladder where each rung reveals new forms of not knowing. The questions get better. The confusion gets more interesting. But it's still confusion. You just learn to find it exhilarating instead of threatening. This is why people who learn quickly in one domain can often learn quickly in others. It's not because they're smart. It's because they've developed a relationship with confusion. They recognize it. They don't panic when it shows up. They know it's the signal that actual learning is about to happen. It's like a climber who's learned to trust the harness. The fear doesn't go away, but you move through it differently. So when you're learning something new and you feel stupid, that's not evidence you're in the wrong place. That's evidence you're in exactly the right place. The feeling of stupidity is the sensation of your brain building new structure. It's supposed to feel weird. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. That discomfort you feel when you don't understand something, that's not a sign you're failing. That's the sound of your neurons making connections they've never made before. That's growth happening in real time. And here's something most people never realize. The smartest people in the world feel this sensation more often than anyone else. because they're constantly pushing into territories where they have no map, no guide, no familiar landmarks. They've just learned not to interpret that feeling as inadequacy. They've learned to interpret it as progress. I remember talking to a mathematician once who told me something that changed how I see learning forever. He said, "When I'm working on a problem and I feel completely lost, I get excited because I know I'm about to understand something I didn't understand yesterday." Think about that shift. Same sensation, completely different meaning. The people who never feel stupid are the people who never grow. They're living in a world they already understand, having conversations they've already had, thinking thoughts they've already thought. There's a kind of comfort in that, sure, but there's also a kind of death, because your brain is designed to adapt. It's built for challenge. When you remove challenge, when you remove the feeling of being overwhelmed or confused, you're not protecting yourself. You're atrophying. You're choosing comfort over capability. And I get it. I understand the appeal of staying where things make sense. The world feels safer when you understand it. Your ego feels better when you're not confronted with your limitations. But safety and growth exist in tension with each other. You can't maximize both simultaneously. Every expert you admire, every person whose intelligence you respect, every thinker who seems to effortlessly navigate complexity, they all had to spend years feeling stupid, years of not understanding, years of being wrong, of misinterpreting, of building models that collapsed under scrutiny. The difference is they kept going. They kept showing up to the discomfort. They kept asking questions even when the questions revealed how much they didn't know. They treated confusion not as a destination but as a transition state, a place you pass through on your way to clarity. So when you're learning something new and it feels hard, when you're reading something and you have to go back 3 times to understand a single paragraph, when you're in a conversation and you're desperately trying to keep up, remember this. You're not falling behind. You're right where you're supposed to be. You're in the wilderness, and that's where transformation happens. I want to tell you something that changed how I see confusion forever. I was sitting in my car once, parked outside a library, feeling absolutely defeated after trying to understand a concept for weeks. And I watched this kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, struggling to tie his shoes on the library steps. He kept making loops that fell apart, getting frustrated, starting over, and his mum just sat there, patient, not intervening, just watching. And after maybe the 10th attempt, something clicked. His fingers moved differently, not faster, not with more effort, just differently. The loop stayed, the knot held, and the look on his face wasn't triumph. It was recognition, like he'd always known how to do this. He just needed time to remember. That's what confusion is. It's not the absence of understanding. It's the presence of understanding that hasn't fully arrived yet. It's already there, in the back of your mind, making connections you're not conscious of, building pathways you can't see. Your brain is doing the work even when it feels like nothing's happening. Neuroscientists call this productive struggle. Your brain literally forms stronger neural connections when you're confused than when information comes easily. The frustration you feel, that's growth happening in real time. That's your brain saying, this matters enough to work for, but here's what nobody tells you about being the smartest person in the room. You start to need that feeling. You start to need to be the one with answers. And the moment you don't have them, it feels like failure. It feels like you've been exposed as a fraud because your intelligence became your identity. And now you're in a situation where that identity is being challenged. I've watched brilliant people avoid entire fields of knowledge because admitting they don't understand something feels too vulnerable. I've seen them dismiss subjects as not interesting or not worth the time, when really they're just protecting themselves from the discomfort of being a beginner again. And the tragedy is, the things they're avoiding might be exactly what they need. The perspectives they're missing might be the ones that would make everything else they know more meaningful. But they'll never find out because they've built walls around their intelligence, and confusion feels like an intruder. You know what the actual smartest people do? They collect confusion like rare coins. They seek it out. They know that every moment of genuine confusion is pointing them toward an edge they haven't explored yet. They're not afraid of not knowing, because they understand that not knowing is just the first step in a process they've been through 1,000 times before. And that's the real difference. Most people experience confusion as a threat. They feel their grip on understanding slipping, and they panic. They retreat back to what they already know, even if what they already know isn't working. They'd rather be confident and wrong than uncertain and learning. But the rare few, they've built a completely different relationship with the unknown. When they don't understand something, they get curious. When something doesn't make sense, they lean in. They ask better questions. They approach the gap in their knowledge like an archaeologist approaches a dig site, with patience, with tools, with the genuine expectation that there's something valuable buried there. I've watched this play out countless times. Two people encounter the same complex problem. One person gets frustrated, declares it too complicated, and moves on. The other person sits with it, breaks it down, draws diagrams, asks for perspectives, tries different angles, doesn't give up until the fog clears. And here's what nobody tells you. The fog always clears. Always. If you stay with something long enough, if you keep examining it from different angles, if you refuse to pretend you understand when you don't eventually, clarity comes. Not because you're brilliant, but because that's how understanding actually works. It's a process of iteration, not revelation. Think about the last time you truly mastered something difficult. I guarantee you went through a phase where it felt impossible, where your brain hurt, where you couldn't see how all the pieces fit together. But you kept going, you kept practicing, you kept asking questions, and then one day, maybe not all at once, but gradually it started to make sense. The connections formed, the patterns emerged. That's not talent, that's process. And once you recognize that pattern, once you see that confusion is just a sign you're learning something real, you stop being afraid of it. You start seeking it out deliberately. You start choosing the harder books, the more complex problems, the conversations that challenge your assumptions. You become comfortable with not knowing because you trust that you can figure it out. And this changes your entire relationship with risk. Most people avoid risk because they don't trust themselves to handle what comes next. They see the unknown as a threat, a void filled with potential failure, humiliation, loss. But when you've seen yourself adapt, when you've watched yourself walk into situations you weren't ready for and emerge different, stronger, more times risk stops looking like danger. It starts looking like opportunity. I'm not talking about reckless risk, not the gambler throwing everything on red because he's desperate or delusional. I'm talking about calculated risk informed by self-knowledge. The kind where you say, I don't know if this will work, but I know I can handle it not working. That's a fundamentally different calculation than most people make. Most people ask, what if I fail? You start asking, what will I learn either way? And suddenly, the downside shrinks, because even failure becomes data. Even mistakes become part of your evolution. You take the job that scares you. You start the project that feels too ambitious. You have the conversation you've been avoiding, not because you're fearless, but because you've redefined what failure means. Failure isn't the end of your story. It's a chapter, sometimes a painful one, sure, but still just a chapter. And here's where it gets really interesting. Other people start noticing. Not because you're bragging or performing confidence, but because there's something different about how you move through the world. You don't collapse when plans change. You don't spiral when criticized. You don't need constant validation to keep going. You have an anchor that isn't tied to external circumstances. People feel that. They might not be able to name it, but they feel it. They start coming to you with harder problems, bigger opportunities, more responsibility, because competence is magnetic. Real competence, the kind that comes from genuine self-trust, draws people in. And the beautiful part? You're not trying to impress anyone. You're just living from a place of knowing what you're capable of. You've done the work in private, the hard, unsexy work of building yourself when nobody was watching, and now it shows up in everything you do. Your relationships improve because you're not needy. Your career accelerates because you're not fragile. Your creativity expands because you're not afraid of your own ideas. All because you chose to trust evidence over emotion. All because you did the thing when you didn't feel like it. And that's when the real transformation starts to show up in places you never expected. Your relationships shift. Not because you lecture people about discipline or become some insufferable productivity robot, but because you stop being so reactive. When someone criticizes you, there's this pause now, this space between what they said and how you respond. You're not defensive anymore because you're not protecting some fragile story about yourself. You become the person others are curious about, not jealous of, not intimidated by, curious. Because there's something different in how you carry yourself. You're not trying to prove anything. You're just doing your thing, day after day, and people notice. I've seen this happen with someone close to me. 5 years ago, they were the person everyone worried about. The one who couldn't hold down a job, who always had drama, who blamed circumstances for everything. Then something clicked. They started showing up for themselves in small ways. Gym, 3 times a week. Reading before bed instead of scrolling. Taking responsibility without being asked. Nobody made a big deal about it. But slowly, conversations changed. People started asking their opinion on things, including them in opportunities. Not because they suddenly became smarter or more talented, but because they became reliable. They became someone who did what they said they would do. That reliability is magnetic. It compounds just like the discipline itself. And here's where it gets really interesting. Your standards rise, but your judgment of others softens. You stop being so harsh on people who are struggling because you remember what that struggle felt like. You remember the versions of yourself that couldn't get out of bed, that scrolled for hours, that made excuses. But you also stop enabling. You don't rescue people from consequences anymore. You don't participate in the complaining sessions. Not out of superiority, out of boundary setting. You've built something valuable in yourself, and you protect it now. This is the phase where people from your old life might fade away. And that's okay. You're not abandoning anyone. You're just no longer available for the patterns that kept you stuck. Some people will respect that and rise with you. Others won't, and that's their choice to make. And here's what's beautiful about that: you stop taking it personally. You used to think that if someone didn't understand you, you needed to explain yourself better. If they rejected your growth, you needed to convince them harder. But now you realize that not everyone is meant to witness every version of you. Not everyone earned a front row seat to your evolution. You become protective of your energy in a way that used to feel selfish but now feels sacred. You stop draining yourself trying to maintain connections that require you to shrink. You stop performing your old self to make others comfortable. Because you finally understand that loyalty to your growth is not betrayal to your past. It's honoring the journey that brought you here. I remember sitting across from an old friend, someone I'd known for 15 years, and realizing mid-conversation that we no longer spoke the same language. Not literally, but emotionally, psychologically. They were still complaining about the same situations, cycling through the same victim narratives, expecting me to co-sign their stagnation like I used to. And for the first time, I felt no obligation to pretend. I didn't argue. I didn't try to fix them. I just listened with compassion and left with clarity. That friendship didn't end dramatically, it just quietly completed itself. And instead of guilt, I felt gratitude. Gratitude that I'd grown enough to recognize when something had run its course. Gratitude that I no longer needed to cling to connections that my soul had already outgrown. This is the discernment that transformation brings. You learn the difference between people who celebrate your light and people who only liked you dim. Between those who are curious about your journey and those who are offended by it. Between relationships built on mutual growth and relationships built on mutual dysfunction. And when you make space by releasing what no longer fits, you create room for what does. New connections start appearing, people who operate at your new frequency, who speak your new language, who understand the terrain you're navigating because they're walking a similar path. These aren't better people, necessarily. They're just people who match who you're becoming, and the difference is palpable. Conversations that used to feel like work now feel like flow. Connection that used to require constant maintenance now feels sustainable. Friendships that used to drain you now energize you, not because you found perfect people, but because you found compatible people. There's alignment instead of friction, resonance instead of resistance. And here's what nobody tells you about this shift. It often happens quietly. There's no dramatic announcement, no friendship breakup speech, no confrontation or closure. Sometimes people just fade. The group chat goes quiet. The invitations stop coming. Plans get made without you, not from malice, but from natural drift. And you realize you're not hurt by it. You're relieved. Because maintaining those connections was costing you more than losing them ever could. That's the moment you know something fundamental has changed. When absence feels lighter than presence used to. When solitude feels more nourishing than certain company. When you'd rather be alone than compromise what you're building within yourself. That's not isolation. That's discernment. That's knowing the difference between loneliness and necessary space. Between social connection and soul connection. But let me be clear about something important. This process isn't about superiority. It's not about looking down on people who aren't where you are. It's not about judgment or ego or thinking you've evolved beyond everyone else. That's just another trap, another way the ego hijacks growth and turns it into separation. Real transformation makes you more compassionate, not more critical. It gives you empathy for where people are because you remember being there yourself. You start seeing people's patterns not as character flaws but as survival strategies, their defensiveness as protection, their resistance as fear, their chaos as the only language they've learned. And you can hold space for that reality while also holding boundaries around your own. You can wish them well while walking away. You can love people and still choose not to keep them in your daily life. These aren't contradictions. They're the nuanced truths of adult relationships. And here's what nobody tells you about that nuance. It doesn't make you inconsistent. It makes you honest. We've been sold this binary thinking where if you truly loved someone, you'd move mountains to keep them close. If you valued the relationship, you'd endure anything to maintain it. But that's not love. That's martyrdom dressed up in greeting card philosophy. Real love sometimes looks like saying, I care about you deeply, and that's precisely why I need to step back. It looks like honoring what someone meant to you while accepting that what they mean to you has changed. It looks like gratitude for the past without obligation to the future. I think about friendships I've had where we shared everything, late night conversations, dreams, fears, the whole intimate landscape of our lives. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, we started sharing less, not because of drama or betrayal, but because we were becoming different versions of ourselves. The person I was becoming didn't need what that friendship offered anymore, and honestly, the person they were becoming probably didn't need what I offered either. There's grief in that realization. I won't pretend there isn't, but there's also freedom. Because when you stop trying to force connections that have run their natural course, you create space for something unexpected. You create room for relationships that actually fit who you're becoming, not who you were. You stop performing nostalgia and start living presently. And sometimes this is the part that really messes with people. Sometimes those old connections circle back around years later, and they fit again in a completely different way. Not because you both stayed the same, but because you both evolved enough to appreciate each other freshly. The friendship that couldn't survive your 20s becomes the one that sustains your 40s, precisely because you let it go when it needed to end. But that only happens when you're brave enough to release your grip in the first place. The people who cling desperately to every relationship, trying to preserve them exactly as they were, end up surrounded by relationships that feel like museums. Beautiful in their way, sure, but lifeless. All preservation, no presence. The healthiest relationships I've witnessed aren't the ones without conflict or change. They're the ones where both people have developed what I call flexible commitment. They're committed to each other, absolutely. But the commitment isn't to a frozen image of who the other person was. It's to whoever they're becoming. I watched my aunt and uncle navigate this beautifully over 30 years. He was a conservative banker when they married. She was a quiet homemaker. Then, in her 40s, she went back to school, became a therapist, developed entirely new political views, new friends, new passions. He could have fought it. Could have said, "This isn't who I married." Instead, he got curious, started asking questions, challenged some of his own assumptions. They didn't transform at the same pace or in the same directions, but they stayed interested in each other's journey. That's the thing. Interest might be more important than agreement. You don't have to love every change in someone. You don't have to pretend you're thrilled when they develop a passion you find boring or adopt a viewpoint you disagree with. But if you can stay genuinely curious about why they're changing, what it means to them, what they're discovering about themselves, the relationship stays alive. The alternative is that quiet death, where you're still together but you've stopped actually seeing each other. You're responding to memories and expectations, not to the person sitting across from you right now. I've noticed something about people who handle change well in relationships. They distinguish between core and periphery. Not everything that changes is equally significant. Your partner cuts their hair, takes up pottery, changes careers, makes new friends. These are peripheral changes. Yes, they affect your life together, but they don't fundamentally alter the relationship itself. But when your partner starts withdrawing affection without explanation, when communication patterns shift dramatically, when shared dreams get quietly abandoned, when intimacy becomes transactional or disappears entirely, these are central changes. These alterations strike at the heart of what makes your relationship yours. And here's what makes this so psychologically treacherous. Central changes often disguise themselves as peripheral ones at first. Your partner stops initiating physical intimacy, but they blame work stress. They become emotionally distant, but they say they're just tired. They stop talking about the future you plan together, but they claim they're being more realistic. The central change wears the mask of something temporary and external. You accept the surface explanation because the alternative is too frightening to consider. Acknowledging that something fundamental has shifted means confronting the possibility that the relationship itself is transforming into something you didn't sign up for. So you tell yourself it's just a phase. You minimize. You rationalize. You cling to the peripheral explanation while the central truth grows undeniable in the space between you. I've watched people spend years accommodating what they believed were temporary adjustments, only to finally realize they'd been slowly accepting a completely different relationship than the one they thought they were in. The person who agreed to give them space for a few months discovered that emotional distance had become the new default. The person who understood their partner needed to focus on their career woke up one day to find they were living with a stranger who happened to share their address. The cruelty of central changes is that they redefine the terms of your relationship without your explicit consent. You never agreed to a marriage without physical affection. You never signed up for a partnership where you'd feel lonely in your own home. You never chose a relationship where your needs would become perpetual inconveniences. But here you are, living in one, because the change happened gradually enough that you never noticed the moment when temporary adjustment became permanent reality. And the most insidious part? You've probably convinced yourself that noticing this decline makes you the problem, that a good partner wouldn't keep mental tallies of who initiates and who responds. That love means accepting whatever diminished version of connection she's willing to offer, without complaint, without standards, without boundaries. But here's what they don't tell you about unconditional love. It was never supposed to mean unconditional tolerance of being treated as optional. Real love, sustainable, healthy love has conditions. It requires effort, reciprocity, consistent demonstration that the other person still values your presence in their life. And when those conditions stop being met, when the relationship becomes a one-sided exercise in accommodation and compromise, you're not experiencing love anymore. You're experiencing the hollow shell of what love used to be, maintained through nothing but momentum and your unwillingness to admit it's already over. Think about how you'd counsel a friend in this exact situation. If your brother came to you and described a relationship where he always initiates, always adjusts, always sacrifices, while his partner treats him like background furniture that occasionally requires acknowledgement, what would you tell him? You'd see it immediately, wouldn't you? The imbalance, the disrespect, the slow erosion of his dignity happening right in front of him. Yet when it's your life, you rationalize, you make excuses, you tell yourself she's stressed, she's tired, she's going through something, and maybe she is. But at what point does going through something stop being a valid explanation for treating you like you don't matter? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Everyone is going through something. Everyone is carrying weight. Everyone has stress and worry and bad days and challenges. But most people still manage to treat the people they care about with basic consideration. You've had terrible days at work, days when everything went wrong, when you were exhausted, when you could barely think straight. And yet, you still texted her back. You still made time for a phone call. You still showed up when you said you would. Your stress didn't give you permission to disappear on her. So why does hers give her permission to disappear on you? The answer is simple, and it hurts, because you've accepted it. You've set the boundary so low that she doesn't have to clear even the smallest bar. She knows, consciously or not, that you'll still be there no matter how little she gives, that you'll wait, that you'll understand, that you'll make excuses for her that she's not even making for herself. And listen, I'm not saying she's a villain. I'm not saying she's deliberately manipulating you or playing games. Most of the time, these women aren't malicious. They're just comfortable with your attention, comfortable with your consistency, comfortable knowing that you're an option they can return to whenever they're ready. But you're not an option. You're a person with feelings and needs and a life that deserves to be valued. Here's what changes when you truly understand this. You stop waiting for permission to move forward. You stop needing her to validate your decision to choose yourself. You stop hoping that if you just give it one more week, one more month, things will magically shift. You realize that the relationship you want, the real, reciprocal, healthy connection, doesn't exist. What exists is a one-sided dynamic where you're auditioning for a role she's never actually offered you. And auditioning is exhausting when there's no actual part to win. So you make a decision, not out of anger or bitterness, but out of clarity. You decide that your energy, your time, your emotional investment, they're worth more than breadcrumbs. They're worth more than inconsistency packaged as keeping things casual. And when you make that decision, when you finally choose yourself over the chaos, something shifts in you. It's not dramatic. There's no lightning bolt, no sudden epiphany that makes everything clear. It's quieter than that. It's a settling, a knowing, a gentle but firm realization that you've been carrying weight that was never yours to carry. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes, hoping for a message that might never come. You stop analyzing their words, searching for hidden meanings in punctuation marks and response times. You stop performing mental gymnastics to justify why someone who truly valued you would treat you like an afterthought. And in that space, that newly reclaimed emotional territory, you start to remember who you were before all of this. Before you became someone who accepted inconsistency as connection. Before you convinced yourself that sporadic attention was better than none at all. You remember what it felt like to have standards, to have boundaries that weren't negotiable, to understand, deep in your bones, that your presence in someone's life is a privilege, not a convenience they can access whenever the mood strikes. Here's what they don't tell you about walking away from situationships. It's not about punishing the other person. It's not about making them realize what they lost, though sometimes that happens. It's about reclaiming your own narrative. It's about refusing to be a supporting character in someone else's story when you deserve to be the protagonist of your own. The people who are meant for you, the ones who genuinely want you in their lives, they don't make you guess. They don't leave you hanging in emotional limbo, wondering where you stand. They show up consistently, not perfectly, because nobody's perfect, but with intention, with clarity, with the kind of presence that says, "You matter to me, and I'm not afraid to show it." And once you've experienced that kind of certainty, that kind of mutual investment, you realize just how much energy you wasted on people who were never going to meet you halfway. You realize that all those months or years spent in relationship purgatory weren't about them being confused or not ready. They were about you accepting less than you deserved. So you let them go, not with fanfare or dramatic proclamations. You simply stop participating in your own diminishment. You stop answering texts that make you feel small. You stop attending gatherings where you're treated like an afterthought. You stop volunteering explanations for choices that require none. And here's what nobody tells you about that moment. It's quiet. There's no orchestra swell, no montage of you walking away in slow motion while everything explodes behind you. It's just you, on a Tuesday afternoon, not responding to a message that would have once sent you spiraling into justification mode. It's you, declining an invitation without crafting an elaborate excuse. It's you, sitting with the discomfort of someone's disappointment and realizing that their disappointment is not your emergency. This is where the real work begins, because distance without discernment is just avoidance. You're not running away, you're walking toward something better, toward people who don't require you to shrink, toward spaces where your presence is celebrated, not tolerated. I started noticing who checked in without agenda, who asked how I was doing and actually waited for the real answer, who celebrated my wins without immediately pivoting to their own. These people had been there all along, but I'd been too busy trying to water dead plants to notice the garden growing beside me. You learn to protect your energy like the finite resource it is. You realize that not every thought requires your opinion, not every argument requires your participation, not every person requires your light. Some people are meant to be loved from a distance, not with bitterness, but with clarity. You can wish them well while refusing to let them drain you dry. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, your life changes shape. The constant hum of anxiety that you'd mistaken for normal begins to fade. The weight you didn't realize you were carrying, the exhaustion of performing, proving, defending your right to exist as you are, starts to lift. You have more energy for the things that matter, more patience for the people who deserve it, more capacity for joy because you're not constantly bracing for criticism. This is what's waiting on the other side of letting go. Not perfection, not a life free of difficulty, but a life aligned with your truth, a life where your inner voice is the loudest one in the room.